So there was a beautiful, beautiful article that I read on Facebook this week. So we're going to start this Sunday with the gospel according to Facebook. Are you ready? So it was written by a woman named Rachel Macy Stafford. And she says this: "My daughter handed me her school progress report. Although it displayed a steady stream of positive check marks, there was one check mark standing dejectedly alone from the rest. 'How am I doing, Mom?' my child asked with a level of maturity that did not match the small, disheveled person gazing up at me with smudged eyeglasses that teetered on the tip of her nose. With her small finger, she pointed to her teacher's neatly printed words next to the lone check mark. It read, 'Distracted in large groups.' But I already knew this. I knew this long before it was written on an official report card. Since she was a toddler, this child offered astute observations of the world around her. After pointing out all of the positives on the progress report, I told her what was written. Upon hearing the news, she gave a tiny, uncertain smile and shyly admitted, 'I do look around a lot.' But before my child could feel 1 ounce of shame, 1 iota of failure, I came down on bended knee and looked her straight in the eye. I didn't want her to just hear these words. I wanted her to feel them. This is what I said. 'Yes, you do look around a lot. You noticed Sam sitting off by himself with a skinned knee on the field trip, and you comforted him. You noticed Banjo had a runny nose, and the vet said it was a good thing we brought him in when we did. You noticed our waitress was working really hard and suggested we leave an extra good tip. You noticed Grandpa was walking slower than the rest of us, so you waited for him. You noticed the beautiful view every time we crossed the bridge to go to swim practice. And you know what? I don't ever want you to stop noticing, because that is your gift. It is the gift that you give to the world. As I watched my daughter beam with the glow of acceptance, I realized her approach to life had the power to change the world. You see, we are all just waiting for someone to notice our pain, notice our scars, notice our fear, notice our joy, notice our triumphs, and notice our courage. And the one who notices is a rare and beautiful gift. Let us all be noticers today." Anyone want to go back and have that mama? No, just kidding. I could hardly get through that reading without crying. Why? Because things that we often call different, things that make us unique, are often used to pull us apart, are often used to tear us down, are often used to separate us from others, are often used to create insecurities, to create feelings of not being good enough and not being whole. And what does the feeling of not being good enough and not being whole create? It creates a separation from not only each other, but a separation from our feeling and our experience of God consciousness, because it is our true nature. Wholeness is our true nature. Divine worth is our true nature. And in the great mind of God, in the great source of all life, you are perfect and blessed, whole and complete. But the human condition is one where we look at differences and we map them out and we make differences become divisions. Humans have a hard time understanding each other, even getting along, no? We allow these differences to become wedges, to become burdens. Carter Woodson said, "If you can control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his action. When you determine what a man shall think, you do not have to concern yourself about what he will do. If you make a man feel that he is inferior, you do not have to compel him to accept an inferior status, for he will seek it himself." I'm going to say that part again. If you make a man feel that he is inferior, you do not have to compel him to accept an inferior status, for he will seek it himself. If you make a man think that he is justly an outcast, you do not have to order him to the back door. He will go without being told. And if there is no back door, his very nature will demand one. There is an author who has done amazing research in the field of transpersonal psychology, interpersonal psychology, mysticism. His name is Ken Wilber, and his work is pretty advanced, pretty heady. But he wrote a book called No Boundaries. And in this book, he identified what happens when we make these differences problems. He said that the human mind needs to kind of put things into segments to understand them, right? We're meaning-making machines. So we see things as like, this is me, that's not me. We see things as this is a chair, well, that's a carpet. We create these distinctions that actually, in truth, in reality, don't really exist. It's all a part of a whole. But we create them, and he calls them lines. Just lines. Lines are places where we have meaning. There's one thing, there's another thing. The problem is not in these lines. It's how we process the world. The problem is when these lines become boundaries. The problem is when these lines become boundaries. So we can see that also as the idea that these lines become fences. These lines become something not drawing us into making sense of our world and understanding our world, but actually segregating and separating in consciousness and in reality. Ken Wilber said this. He said, "The ultimate metaphysical secret, if we dare to state it so simply, is that there are no boundaries in the universe. No boundaries. Boundaries are an illusion, products not of reality, but of the way we map and edit reality. And while it's fine to map out the territory, it's fatal to confuse the two. While it's fine to map out the territory, it is fatal to confuse the two." He talks about ultimate reality, and he says, to say that ultimate reality is a unity of opposites is actually to say that in ultimate reality, there are no boundaries anywhere. So how can we test ourselves? What's the litmus test to see whether or not we're seeing in lines and making distinctions, or we're living in a world where we have created boundaries? Because we know that any creation of a boundary keeps us from God consciousness, right? Anything that keeps me from feeling connected, from feeling a part of the whole, is a boundary. It's a wall, it's a fence, whatever we want to call it. So what's a litmus test to know whether or not we're doing that? Well, anytime you see a difference, anytime you see a distinction, does our consciousness separate and use that boundary, use that line, use that idea to separate us from someone else? Do we use those ideas to separate ourselves from the experience of God or from the experience of our high self? If we do, then it's a boundary, not a line. If we use it to segregate, if it leads us away from peace and harmony, then it becomes a boundary, and a boundary is a burden. When we define the way we are and the way someone else is, and that definition, that defining, leads us to disappointment, and it leads us to harm rather than to harmony and understanding, we are utilizing our conscious co-creative power to create a boundary. And when we do that, we are missing the mark, deeply missing the mark. So how do we make the shift? How do we consciously interact in our own minds, in our own field of consciousness, and in our own world when the human condition is one that naturally creates boundaries? We can't so much call it wrong, right? Because it just is what it is. But when we have a spiritual practice, we have the ability to flip the coin to the other side, to have a new perspective, to see with spiritual vision rather than sense consciousness. That is our divine birthright. That is our calling. That is our charge. That is our ability. We so often fail to use it and fall short of using it to its fullest potential. Howard Thurman, in talking about transcending these walls that divide, said that human life is one, and all men are members of one another. And this insight is spiritual, and it is the hard core of the religious experience. The hard core of the religious experience. So how do we begin to transcend those walls that divide? Well, one of the first things to do is that great Greek proverb, know thyself. Do you believe that if you know thyself, you arrive at love? And that through knowing thyself, you actually meet all of creation? When we truly, truly know thyself, we meet and behold the Christ presence, the awakened one, the soul self of everyone around us. Fillmore's called this our individuality, our real self, our divine nature, our I am. Once we dive into that, there's no going back because something unfolds within us. A compassion grows and a wisdom grows within us. And we begin to have the space not just to accept the differences that exist, but to actually begin to appreciate them. Not just to accept the differences, but to begin to appreciate them. And what happens when we begin to appreciate the differences, just like in that story about the mother and the daughter, what happens when we appreciate the differences is that we make way for more God in this world. We make way for more good in this world. We make way for more gifts in this world. That energy of pure acceptance and appreciation is an energy that's a catalyst for healing. Has anyone had someone that they have had in their lives that no matter what, no matter how you show up, all of you is welcome there? All of you is welcome. That is that parental love. That is that divine love. The love that says you are whole, you are welcome here. The love that sees your light. That love is a catalyst. It creates an environment for healing. So, when we are faced with looking at our senses of separation, can we, instead of taking these differences as boundaries, can we take them as doorways to understanding? Can we know that every time we have created a boundary, we can actually open a door there and recognize that this doorway, if I am willing to step into it, will lead to the realm of heaven consciousness, will lead to an experience of wholeness for self and others. So think about those boundaries in our lives that we create and think about whether or not we're going to use them to separate ourselves or we're going to use them for learning and divine understanding. The next thing to do with it is to look at all the ways that we educate ourselves in this world. We educate ourselves academically. We educate ourselves socially as far as our community climate. But how often do we take the time to educate ourselves about the self and others? There are technologies that have been developed that lead to harmonious understanding, that lead to wisdom interactions. One is the Enneagram, which is we're going to have a workshop with Nian after the service. The personality type studies help people open up to understanding themselves. And again, when people understand themselves, they begin to have light around the understanding of others. And when that light is around the understanding of others, there is, again, space for connection, space for healing. Has anyone ever read a horoscope or found out your sign or something like that, read something that it described just how you are in the things that you classify as your good and as your bad. And then all of a sudden, when you either read that or you saw someone else read it or see it, it was like a great burden was lifted off their shoulder, like a great relief, like, oh my gosh, well, I'm just a Virgo. Or, well, he's just an Aquarius. That's how it is. That's how they are. There is something about understanding. I think the human psyche wants to define something, wants to understand something, and will wrestle with it or even call it wrong until it gets it. And once it just knows, once it has a little information, right, then it can release that and just be in that joy, just be in that presence, just be in that experience. So learning taking on the path of learning. There's a couple other great works out there if you want to take this lesson deeper on your own. There's the Enneagram and the personality types. There's Marshall Rosenberg's Nonviolent Communication. He recently made his transition, but this book and this work is all about compassionate communication. It's all about understanding and knowing oneself and one's needs and being able to also presence someone else's. And through that presencing, create a dynamic and a living and a working harmonious relationship and interaction. These works are not small. These works have been used to transform communities, to heal injuries that have been passed down for generation to generation. The other one that I absolutely love is Gary Chapman's The 5 Languages of Love, love languages. If you dive into that, you get an understanding of where you're coming from and where someone else is coming from, and it can soften those spaces where we may be tempted to create a boundary. And instead, they invite us to open a doorway to understanding. And that doorway is the doorway to heaven consciousness. Another idea is to recognize anytime we are faced with something that we think is against us, that something is a problem or something is different in the world or in ourselves, is to recognize that God is not the problem. We tend to do these prayers and launch these prayers as if I just launch a prayer, well, God will fix it, God will harmonize it, God will shift it. Well, God is the grand overall design. It is the universal wisdom. That universal wisdom can do nothing to you that it can't do through you. It can do nothing to us that it can't do through us. It can do nothing to me that I can't call up in myself, that I can't make myself a receptive vessel to. So I can pray all I want, but if I'm not willing to apply wisdom, if I'm not willing to dedicate my human intelligence to bringing forth these ideas, and I'm not saying just look for them, not looking for ways of harmony and ways that we're all the same, but saying, I know the principle, I know the practice is that there is one power and one presence. I know that we are universally connected and bonded. I know that we are whole. I know that we are all part of the same. How do I use my human intelligence, use interpersonal technology to let my human self remember this truth and call it up? We don't go looking for just the demonstrations of saying, show me, universe, how this is true. Because we're going to find a lot of places where it doesn't seem to be true, right? You can just look at the wars going around the world right now. You can look at all of the ideas. Some people have even totally thrown out religion because what has caused more harm on our planet than these ideas of religion? And I would argue that that's not true religion. That's not true religion. That's systematic. That's organizational structure. But it can be used to divide us, no? So what is ours to do is to know the principle and to raise the human condition to that demonstration of the principle in action. I know there is oneness. I know the core of me is the core of you. Show me. Show me that truth in action. One of my favorite parts in any film, is a part in Cold Mountain where there's a conversation between Ada and Ruby. And Ada says, and I have to edit a little bit of her language for Sunday morning, but Ada says they're talking about the war and just the disgust and how is this still happening and people are dying, and it's this very intense and emotional moment in the film. And Ada says, every piece of this is man's, I'm putting in creation. They call this war a cloud over the land, but they made the weather, and then they stand in the rain and say, bleep, it's raining. They made the weather, and then they go stand in the rain and go, it's raining. Like, God, stop the rain. There's no problem in God. There is no problem in God. Eric Butterworth says the cause of human problems is failure to engage seriously in the process of growth. That's where we're missing the mark. In his book, Your Power to Be, former minister of Unity Village Chapel, Sig Paulson says this: human relations is the most urgent area of human endeavor. And this is a long time ago that he was here. It's still the truth right now. Once we solve human relationships in love, our other problems will be well on their way to solution. Racial, religious, social disapproval blocks the flow of love that is the only energy capable of establishing peace and understanding on the earth. That energy of love. Charles Fillmore called love the great harmonizer. So how do we open up to that love? Are we ready to put our principles into action, to learn about ourselves so deeply, to learn about others so deeply that we allow that universal wisdom to help us transcend the ego's compulsion to turn lines into boundaries? From Proverbs 3:13 through 20. Blessed are those who find wisdom, those who gain understanding. For she is more profitable than silver, and her yield better returns than gold. She is more precious than rubies. Nothing else you desire can compare with her. Long life is in her right hand, and in her left are riches and honor. Her ways are pleasant ways, and all her paths are peace. She is a tree of life to those who take hold of her. Those who hold her fast will be blessed. By wisdom the Lord laid the earth's foundation. By understanding set the heavens in place. By knowledge the watery depths were divided, and the clouds let drop the dew. Are we willing to dive in to human and interpersonal intelligence and allow it to transcend into spiritual intelligence by helping us recognize the reality of our sameness, our oneness, the absolute, and take on the vision and the commitment to put no distinction or difference, no boundary, no barrier in the way of this experience? The ego will continue to separate and to see differences as problems and obstacles. It will mistakenly try to control or manipulate or to shift to get its way and to have sameness, those lower identities. But our true craving, our true desire is for oneness, not control and not sameness. Spiritual intelligence allows us to be intrigued and informed by the appearances of differences and to trace these differences back to the universal core that is existent in all beings, to actually create understanding. Do you believe this is our calling? To be in wisdom, to be in understanding? I believe it is. It's our calling, it's our charge. It is each one of us who is going to make way, who is going to stop the rain and instead dance in it. It is each one of us, moment by moment, relationship by relationship, step by step. Rumi said, whether love is from earth or heaven, it leads to God. The word palal in Sanskrit is prayer, and it means seeing oneself as wondrously made. The word prayer, palal, means seeing oneself as wondrously made. Can we do that for ourselves? Can we do that for others? And anytime we see the universal and the human condition invitation to create a boundary, to create a barrier, can we instead open a door? Close with the words of my current hero, Pope Francis. When you're asked that question, who are the 5 people you'd like to have dinner with, I always kind of struggle. Now it's just like, just Pope Francis. That'd be good for me. This is important, he says, to get to know people. Listen. Expand the circle of ideas. The world is crisscrossed by roads that come closer together and move apart. But the important thing is that they lead towards the good. And my friends, that is towards God. Namaste.